Welcome back to Church in the World. I'm Pastor Gary, and I'm here walking with you through the ELCA's social statements. And today, we're on part 2 of our discussion of the statement Gift and Trust, Human Sexuality, Gift and Trust. This was a statement that was adopted in 2009 to great acclaim and great lament on many counts. Most of those counts are going to be ones we talk about today, things that people were worried about. So we're going to hear about those today because today we're talking about sexuality and structures, social structures that enhance social trust, and sexuality and trust in the context of relationships. So here we go. Last time we talked about the theological basis for a lot of this, how relationships have to do with trust, how important trust is to Christians in general, how social structures exist to enhance, support, and nurture trust, right, across all sorts of groups and categories and relationship types. Today we're going to talk about, first we're going to talk about two structures. And that's going to be probably the majority of this video. It's going to have to be because of how complicated it is. Two structures that are socially created that exist as supports for human community, and that is marriage and the family. So first, marriage. Marriage is a covenant of mutual promises, commitment, and hope, authorized legally by the state and blessed by God. The historic Christian tradition and the Lutheran confessions have recognized marriage as a covenant between a man and a woman, reflecting Mark 10, 6 through 9. Note that there Jesus is recalling Genesis 1 and 2. For a long time, Lutherans have affirmed the public accountability of marriage as expressed through legal contract, that it provides necessary social support and social trust for relationships that are intended to be sustained throughout life and within changing and often challenging life situations. In this country, pastors carry both legal and religious responsibilities for marriage. In carrying out these responsibilities, pastors hold and exercise pastoral discretion for the decision to marry in the church. In the community of the church, pastors preside over the mutual promises made between a couple, seeking the lifelong, monogamous, and faithful relationship of marriage. So notice that definition. Marriage is a lifelong commitment, it is a monogamous commitment, and it is a commitment to be faithful. Marriage requires constant care and cultivation. It is intended to protect the creation and nurturing of mutual trust and love as one foundation of human community. It's a binding relationship that provides conditions for personal well-being, the flourishing of the partner, and the possibility of procreation and the nurturing of children. It is also intended to be a blessing to the community and the world. Because of promises of fidelity and public accountability, marriage provides a context of love, trust, honesty, and commitment within which a couple can express the profound joy of relationship, as well as address the troubles that they encounter through life. Christians believe marriage is not solely to legitimate physical sexual intimacy. Marriage is to support long-term and durable communion for the good of others. It is a communion within which the play and delight of physical love are crucial expressions of the depth of trust, and in which love-making can be a tender and generous act of self-giving that tends to the joy and pleasure of the other. The public character of marriage also implies a civil responsibility, right? Marriage is intended not only to protect the people who are married, but to signal to the community their intention to live a peaceful and mutually fulfilling life, even as they endeavor to strengthen the community in which they live, right? So fidelity is central, right? And the promise is central, and the public element is central, right? So marriage is a public contract then, and it's a public relationship insofar as it can't help but be for the community as well as for each other, right? This is something I tell couples in premarital counseling all the time. I say the marriage isn't just about you. It is your marriage, but it's given by God to you, and then you as a married couple are given to the whole human community and all the communities of which you're a part. And that's really important to notice here. Now, of course, sin enters all relationships, both inside and outside the institution of marriage, right? All marriages fall short of intentions. Difficulties are inevitable because of the different needs and desires of two individuals and because of sin. And precisely because marriage is the place where deep human trust and needs abide, it can be a place of great harm. Many experience neither love nor trust within marriage. Harming another emotionally, physically, or spiritually, including through the misuse or abuse of power, is a profound injury It is also a betrayal and violation of the shelter and trust that are intended within the marriage relationship. Particular care must be taken to support and find safe haven for all who are at risk within a marriage. This includes those whose sense of self is destroyed or damaged within the marriage relationship, and therefore whose ability to act or advocate for their own health and safety may be inhibited or even lost. This is something that really does happen, right? Unfortunately, probably too many of you watching this will know of some instance where this has occurred, but it absolutely is the case, as with every other type of relationship of which I know. For sometimes marriages go horrifically, demonically wrong. The church recognizes that in some situations, the trust upon which marriage is built becomes so deeply damaged or so deeply flawed that the marriage itself must come to a legal end. This church does not treat divorce lightly, nor does it disregard the responsibilities of marriage. However, in such situations, it provides support to the people involved and all who are affected. Divorced individuals are encouraged to avail themselves of pastoral care, to be assured of God's presence, forgiveness, and healing, and to remain in the communion of the church, recognizing the all-encompassing mercy of God. Right? It's important to note here also that the church tends pastorally to the special concerns of blended families and the children of divorced parents and the particular tensions that can accompany family breakdowns and transitions. But despite our awareness of the presence of sin and failure of marriage, the church and the Christian tradition places great emphasis on the value of marriage for husband and wife. It is in marriage the highest degrees of physical intimacy are matched with and protected by the highest levels of binding commitment, including legal protection. It is in marriage that public promises of lifetime commitment can create the foundation for trust, intimacy, and safety. Right? Both the couple's intent and lifelong promises and the civil requirement for marriage are really important. Mutual promises are important. The legal contract creates a public arrangement within which the couple can safely and equitably share their assets and resources and arrive at joint decisions and anticipate children and protect and nurture them and plan for a shared future. What are we saying here? Well, we're saying that historically, our experience supports the confidence of Christians that solemn promises made before a company of witnesses who ask for God's blessing on a man and a woman have the power to create a unique framework within which two people, a new family, and the community may thrive. The Church's confidence that such promises, supported by the contractual framework of civil law, can create a lifetime relationship of commitment and cooperation. So marriage is a fundamental good. Divorce is a product of human brokenness and sin. Unfortunately, is all too often the case. We must not idealize the fact of being married to blind us to cases where it has gone horrifically wrong. And then, because you'll notice some pretty big elephants in the room so far, recognizing that this conclusion differs from the historic Christian tradition and the Lutheran confessions, some people, though not all, in this church and within the larger Christian community, by the way, I'm one, conclude that marriage is also the appropriate term to use in describing similar benefits, protection, and support for same-gender couples entering into lifelong monogamous relationships. They believe that such accountable relationships also provide the necessary foundation that supports trust and familial and community thriving. Other contractual agreements, such as civil unions, also seek to provide some of these protections and to hold these involved in such relationships accountable to one another and to society. Note what the public dimension of what we're going to have to talk about here in terms of gay marriage is going to mean, right? The importance of the public accountability in the marriage is very, very high, right? And note that the statement's very clear. Just being committed to each other when no one knows about it isn't enough. There has to be public accountability and, as much as possible, legal accountability, because that provides a basic structure for the trust that's necessary for a lifelong relationship. That's the statement's position here about marriage. It's very important because it's going to feed into what we're about to talk about, which is lifelong monogamous same-gender relationships, right? The ELCA recognizes that many of our sisters and brothers in same-gender relationships sincerely desire the support of other Christians for living faithfully in all aspects of their lives. In response, we have drawn deeply on our Lutheran theological heritage in Scripture. This has led, however, to differing and conscience-bound understandings about the place of such relationships within the Christian community. We have come to various conclusions regarding how to regard lifelong monogamous same-gender relationships, including whether and how to recognize publicly their lifelong commitments. Well, now, first we're going to talk about what is not debated, okay? And then we're going to talk about the points of difference. So it says Lutherans hold various convictions regarding lifelong monogamous same-gender relationships, but the Church is united on many critical issues. The Church opposes all forms of verbal or physical harassment and assault based on sexual orientation. So any violence to anyone based on sexual orientation is rejected. Okay? So every instance you've ever seen on the news where some person, probably citing the Bible, unfortunately, has done some violence, we reject that out of hand. It doesn't matter what our position on same-gender relationships is. That's not relevant there. That's not okay. That is unchristian, period. Okay. The Church supports legislation and policies to protect civil rights and prohibit discrimination in housing, employment, and public services. So basically anything that's not a private business, probably, and even there, and by super private business, right? Public services, employment, and housing need to be equitably available to all people, regardless of their sexual orientation. Period. It's not a matter of debate within the LCA. We have called upon congregations and members to welcome and care for and support same-gender couples and their families, and to advocate for their legal protection. That is not under debate. Okay? Whether to welcome them, whether to care for them, whether to support them, that is not being debated here. The ELCA recognizes as a pastoral responsibility to all children of God. This includes a pastoral responsibility to those who are the same gender in their orientation, and to those who are seeking counsel about their sexual self-understanding. All are encouraged to avail themselves of the means of grace and pastoral care. But this church also acknowledges that consensus does not exist concerning how to regard same-gender committed relationships, even after many years of thoughtful, respectful, and faithful study and conversation. We do not have agreement on whether this church should honor these relationships and uplift, shelter, and protect them, or on precisely how it is appropriate to do so. In response, this church draws on the foundational Lutheran understanding that the baptized are called to discern God's love and service to the neighbor. This is why the last video is 40-something minutes long, to establish that, right? Because this is why it's important for us to know about it. In our Christian freedom, we therefore seek responsible actions that serve others and do so with humility and deep respect for the conscience-bound beliefs of others. We understand that in this discernment about ethics and church practice, faithful people can and will come to different conclusions about the meaning of Scripture and about what constitutes responsible action. We further believe that this church, on the basis of the bound conscience, will include these different understandings and practices within its life as it seeks to live out its mission and ministry in the world. And there it is, the term, the bound conscience. Quick excursus here, because what you're about to hear is called the four positions. And the four positions are four ways that this statement says faithful members may choose to understand same-gender relationships based on their conscience-bound belief and reading of Scripture. And that's really important, the conscience-bound belief. The bound conscience is a really important point in this document because of what it is and is not and how it's been used. What I'm going to try, how it's been used is a different conversation. But today I'm going to try to articulate what the bound conscience is in this document. There's a footnote here on bound conscience, which is in quotes, and it's a footnote to footnote 26. If you scroll all the way down to footnote 26, you will find a lengthy explanation of the bound conscience. And here it is. The Apostle Paul testifies to conscience as the unconditional moral responsibility of the individual before God. Romans 2. In the face of different conclusions about what constitutes responsible action, the concept of the conscience becomes pivotal. So this is about how we're going to persist in the midst of ethical disagreement, okay? When the clear word of God's saving action by grace through faith is at stake, that is to say, a matter of the gospel, Christian conscience becomes as adamant as Paul, who opposed those who insisted upon circumcision, Galatians 1. In the same way, Luther announced at his trial for heresy, quote, "Unless I am persuaded by the testimony of Scripture and by clear reason, I am conquered by the Scripture passages I have adduced, and my conscience is captive to the words of God. I neither can nor desire to recant anything, when to do so against conscience would be neither safe nor wholesome." This is found in Luther's Works, volume 32. However, when the question is about morality or church practice, the Pauline and Lutheran witness is less adamant and believes we may be called to respect the bound conscience of the neighbor. That is, if salvation is not at stake in a particular question, Christians are free to give priority to the neighbor's well-being and will protect the conscience of the neighbor, who may well view the same question in such a way as to affect faith itself. For example, Paul was confident that Christian freedom meant the gospel of Jesus Christ was not at stake in the questions of meat sacrificed to idols or the rituals of holy days in Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 8 and 10. Yet he insisted that if a brother or sister did not understand this freedom and saw eating this meat as idolatry to a pagan god, a Christian was obligated to walk in love by eating just vegetables for the neighbor's sake. This social statement draws upon this rich understanding of the role of conscience and calls upon this church, when in disagreement concerning matters around which salvation is not at stake, including human sexuality, to bear one another's burdens, honor the conscience, and seek the well-being of the neighbor. Now, what has just been said is the bound conscience is to say that because ethical and moral deliberations are not matters of salvation, that is to say, matters of the gospel, in disagreement, Christians should yield their freedom to those who are bound. That is to say, the one who is unable to perceive the exercise of our freedom as anything other than unfaithfulness. Right? That's really interesting, because as we'll see, that should and can cut both ways. How can we tell somebody that we believe that their marriage is an affront to God and not make that a matter of salvation for them, and yet simultaneously, what do we do for those who truly and honestly believe that? But notice that in all cases, the bound conscience is about the neighbor, not you. The bound conscience is never to say, this is what my conscience is bound to, therefore you don't get to have X, Y, Z, or don't get to do X, Y, Z. Quite the opposite. The tradition of the bound conscience is to say, my neighbor believes this, therefore I will not do this, right? It is a voluntary giving up of a freedom where we can, not the voluntary imposition of law on someone else. Why do I say that? Because of the different positions that the ELCA comes to in this statement that it has found. Okay, so here we are. The church recognizes with conviction and integrity 4 basic positions. I'm not going to read all this verbiage, it's getting already too long. Basically, there's some people that believe that being in a same-gender relationship at all is a sin. Some who believe that it's not necessarily a sin, but that it is not best served by publicly recognizing such relationships as traditional marriages, and that they reflect a broken world in which some relationships do not pattern themselves after the creation God intended. The third position is that these relationships should be honored and held to high standards and public accountability, but should not be equated with marriage, but do need community support and the role of pastoral care, and can be covenanted with prayer, right? And then position 4, okay, and this is my position, that the scriptural witness does not address the context of sexual orientation and committed relationships we experience today, that the neighboring community are best served when same-gender relationships are lived out with lifelong and monogamous commitments that are held to the same rigorous standards, sexual ethics, and status as heterosexual marriages, that surround such couples and their lifelong commitments with prayer to live in ways that glorify God, etc. Right? In other words, position 1 is same-gender relationships are fundamentally sinful, and to affirm them is to affirm sin, and that's a problem. The second is to say some relationships are just not going to be what God intended because we live in a shattered world, and that's not necessarily anyone's individual sin. But we probably shouldn't uplift and affirm these relationships too much, although they should be lived out with mutuality and care. They may be lived out with mutuality and care, but we don't believe they're best served by public recognition. The third is, yes, public recognition, but not the same level as marriage. And the fourth is they should be equated with marriage functionally, right? Held at the same standards and supported to the same extent. Now, although the church lacks consensus in this, it encourages all people to live out their faith in the local and global community of the baptized with profound respect for the conscience-bound belief of the neighbor, not of their own conscience-bound belief. The church calls for mutual respect in relationships and for guidance that seeks the good of each individual in the community. The people in this church will continue to accompany one another in study, prayer, discernment, pastoral care, and mutual respect. So look at what's just happened here. We've just affirmed 4 different opinions, some of which are opposites, of lifelong same-gender monogamous relationships. And that's really important to know, because the ELCA is going to have a lot of problems trying to figure out exactly what it means to persist with each other in the midst of that disagreement. And indeed, we'll find that a number of people think that's simply impossible, and that to even propose to do so is a problem. And those people are not only people who take the first position that same-gender relationships are sinful, but in fact, people in all these positions object to this part of the statement, and that's going to be a really big part of what we talk about in the appendix and what the ELCA is continuing to struggle with. Okay, we'll talk briefly about family. This should be fairly obvious, just like Lutherans understand intimacy and trust and safety, particularly for those most vulnerable, are best sheltered within families. But of course, when safety or trust are eroded or destroyed within the family, it becomes dangerous or even a demonic place where abuse can reign. Lutherans take great care to support whatever creates and sustains strong families as a foundation and source of trust, right? Children learn trust or distrust from their earliest relationships. It depends upon parents and others in the household, right? So you see how this is tied together, right? That the family is a structure that creates and sustains and teaches trust and is deeply influential in the child. The family is a source of trust primarily because of the remarkable level of commitment and care that characterizes familial bonds, right? And that's why families can become so horrific when they go wrong, when trust is broken. The church regards the family as an indispensable social institution because of its role in establishing conditions of trust and protection of the vulnerable. Society properly both regulates and shelters families through family law that exists to ensure these critical responsibilities will be met and that dependent family members will be protected and treated justly when households dissolve. Very important. And so well-being is so important in all of this. But realistic awareness of weakness and sin prevents Lutherans from romanticizing family life or setting up false ideals. In particular, sexual abuse or betrayal of promises and commitments within the family constitute flagrant harm precisely because they occur within the context where trust is most assumed. Very, very important. Now, of course, many social trends raise questions about family health, and where these trends do involve individuals carry personal responsibility for their choices. They're also driven by economic and social forces that are complex in origin and significantly resistant to correction. And it talks about the nuclear family a bit, but that just because the nuclear family has been effective for many does not mean it has always been effective. Families can shelter sexism or domestic violence, and the safety of children or others who are harmed is of utmost importance in such situations. Then there's issues of households, millions of households in the church, headed by single parents, right? And the critical issue with respect to the family is not whether it has a conventional form, but how it performs indispensable individual and social tasks. All families have responsibility for the tasks of providing safety, shielding intimacy, and developing trustworthy relationships. There again, you see this pattern over and over again. It's about structures that build trust, structures that build trust, structures that build trust. Because a trusting person tends to be healthier, tends to be better cared for, and tends to be more equipped to be a healthy influence on others. Our first response towards families and households should be one of safety and welcome and support, particularly care for and safety of children, who are invited to be into the community of the baptized regardless of their family situation. We also address and advocate against social and economic trends that counter the development of strong families, right? Why do we want strong families? right? This is what's so interesting about American politics. You've heard of family values, right? But family values aren't values of a specific type of family. It's valuing the relationships of trust, accountability, and support that are created in the family and that are used in the family, right? The church acknowledges with regret the way in which misuse of historical teachings concerning sexuality has harmed individuals, deepened suffering, or torn families apart. This includes actions that abandon or shun people for unwed pregnancy or for same gender orientation. Hate crimes and violence against those who are regarded as sexually different sometimes have been perpetrated publicly in the name of Christ. I've already mentioned that. Not only must such behaviors be denounced, but this church must work towards greater understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity. It must seek that which is positive and life giving while protecting from all that is harmful and destructive. And since social trust is directly related to social justice, this church must call for justice in matters relating to families and sexuality. So complex changes have occurred in family law over the past 50 years relating to divorce, alimony, child support, etc. Right? Continuing evolution of family law is of vital importance as we strive to protect dependent individuals and justly assign responsibility for their care. And these laws have an impact on social trust. Society at large must ensure all who are dependent upon others in the family for spiritual, emotional, and physical well-being are protected by social policies and practices. Even social institutions and practices are not directly related to family institutions, can and should facilitate and support familial care and responsibility, such as tax and poverty law, real estate, and zoning regulations and insurance industry policies and practices. And then there's a section, of course, about protecting children. This is fairly obvious. Abuse and molestation needs to be criminalized and protective of children and youth. This church supports prosecution of any individual who commits a sexual crime against a minor, including leadership positions in this church, right? And so that's actually really important, is that this church supports legal action against those people. Even if I were to do something so horrific, I would be charged, and the ELCA would support that charge, right? We also recognize many sites must continue their efforts to be safe places for children and youth, calling for the adoptive of preventative measures, including educational programs, appropriate policies, and screening of individuals who care for, supervise, and work with children within the church. Then there's the issue of commercial sexual exploitation and how this involves surprising numbers of youth by taking advantage of their vulnerabilities. Sexual exploitation in any situation, either personally or commercially, inside or outside legally contracted marriage, is sinful because it is destructive of God's good gift of sexuality and human integrity. The statement notes how sexualized the world is that children grow up. It's very true. And that children and youth are targets of sexual bullying, destructive language, and vicious humor. Also true. The LCA regards the overexposure of emotionally maturing children and teens to adult sexuality as a failing on the part of adults and society, and challenges all individuals and institutions to fulfill their responsibility to protect and nurture children and youth and provide for their appropriate development. It talks about media, being vigilant to protect people, children and youth in an electronic world with hidden dangers. The widespread electronic availability of violent and degrading pornography threatens children and youth as well as adults, which has the capacity to damage the normal sexual development in those who view it, often obsessively and in secret. How to address this problem is one of the most important child protection and abuse issues of our time, and our church will be active in this conversation. It also talks about how sexual education of children and teens is a priority, to give particular attention to how children and youth are supported, nurtured, and accompanied in their sexual and relational formation. And we've said previously, of course, and we read this in our statement on abortion, that we must begin this kind of education early and emphasize responsibility and mutuality. That information about birth control is an important component of that responsibility. And the ELCA reaffirms its interest in and responsibility for the care and protection of vulnerable children and youth in these regards. Right. I think. And then we're going to talk about sexuality and trust in relationships. Now, this is, of course, I can only gloss over this statement. There's a lot of stuff in here, as you know. So sexuality and trust in relationships is going to be about sexuality and self, gender and friendships, right? Commitment and sexuality, sexual intimacy and adult cohabitation, And all of those sections deserve their own sections. But we're at a half an hour already, so I'm going to gloss very quickly through this. Sexuality and the self. Basically, sexuality is a part of human identity, right? It's not just who you have some sort of sexual contact with or how you have that sexual contact. It's much more than that. We are born with certain types of genitalia, male, female, sometimes ambiguous. Our cells carry sex chromosomes, our endocrine systems infuse our bodies with hormones. In ways that are not fully understood, we develop strong gender identities at a very early stage. And while there's still much to be learned about biological complexity of human beings, we have come to understand that this complexity suggests a variety of sexual orientations and gender identities. Note in this 2009 statement, we are saying that is a biological thing, right? A variety of sexual orientations and gender identities. Sexuality and gender are features of every person's very being. This is both a discovery and a gift, and a perplexity and a challenge at all life stages and in all relational situations. The medical and social sciences continue to explore this range. Sexual capabilities and experiences are part of life for all ages and physical abilities, right? We can experience sexual in music, art, literature, and the beauty of people and nature. We can take sensual pleasure in food, touch, sound, smells, and activities. We can find expression for the self and sexuality through spoken word, touch, dance, music, and movement. One does not need to be in a relationship to experience sexuality. Bodies do not suddenly become sexual at puberty and do not cease to be sexual when, for example, there are physical or developmental limitations, menopause, erectile dysfunction, or the absence of a sexual partner. Throughout our lives, we need to find life-enhancing and appropriate ways of giving expression to this complicated dimension of ourselves. We all have sexual identities that will find expression in our lives, right? That's really important. I want to emphasize that. It goes on at length about this. But there's also a danger, and it has to do with how hard it is to develop and maintain positive attitudes about our bodies sometimes. Too many people struggle for a healthy sense of body as a result of experiences of degradation or shaming by others, including family members or intimate partners. We have to support all people in affirming and reclaiming a sense of healthy sexuality. And we also call attention to the danger of embracing standards of physical attractiveness that exclude many, including the aged and people with disabilities, and which distort the understanding of what it means to be healthy. The young whose bodies are changing and growing may be especially vulnerable to the idealized and commercialized images of a perfect body that play on insecurities and destructive self-loathing. Very important that a holistic understanding of the body and its interrelationship with the mind and the spirit change this narrow understanding of beauty and celebrate human variety and particularity, which gets us to gender and friendships, right? It's important to recognize that friendships are deeply important and that friendships don't have to involve sexual intercourse or sexual contact to be a way of expressing our longing for human connection, touch, and growth, right? They form a mutual commitment that supports us. Many of our understandings of our sexuality and sexual relationships may be formed or nurtured through conversations and confiding in friends, and I'm sure that many people know this. And also we know how hard it is when friendship like family life can be betrayed, abused, and violated. It must be recognized that dysfunctional friendships may be detrimental to health, development, and well-being. We call people to be good, trustworthy friends who support one another in mature self-understanding and healthy companionship. Now, sometimes friendships become sexual in the narrower sense of giving rise to overtly erotic impulses and stimulation. Erotic interest between adults open to a romantic relationship can be a desired part of the growth of trust and intimacy. Erotic interest can also create conflicts and danger. These have to be faced honestly when one or both of the people involved already have made promises of fidelity to another. The conflicts and dangers have been to be recognized also whenever one of the involved individuals does not welcome a deeper and more complicated closeness. Reintroducing distance into such friendships or breaking them off may entail an acceptance of loss that requires courage and maturity. The violation of trusting relationships for sexual purposes is offensive and unacceptable, and when criminal, should be punished accordingly. A particularly egregious violation of friendship is acquaintance rape. And that gets us into commitment, right? Now, this is not going to surprise any of you. Based on the statement, the proper context for sexual contact, especially sexual intercourse, is the highest level of public accountability and highest level of commitment and trust normally marriage, at least in all possible cases, which since this statement has been passed has become possible in the United States of America. All states have same-gender marriage available to them. And that this is because as trust and entrusting are established in a relationship, physical expression naturally becomes more intimate. Sexual intimacy would be expected to follow the same pattern of growth marked by other dimensions of mutual self-understanding. The idea then that this statement is trying to depict is that the relationship is a journey where trust, understanding, and intimacy, emotional, mental, and physical, all grow in proportion to each other, right? And that the idea is to maintain that balance so that the relationship remains healthy and doesn't become unbalanced in its emphases or development. This is really important to understand because this is why the church opposes non-monogamous, promiscuous, or casual sexual relationships of any kind. Indulging immediate desires for sexual satisfaction is to gratify the desires of the flesh. Such transient encounters do not allow for trust in the relationship to create the context for trust in sexual intimacy. Such relationships undermine the dignity and integrity of individuals because physical intimacy is not accompanied by the growth of mutual self-knowledge. Absent the presence of physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual trust and commitment, such sexual relationships may easily damage the self and an individual's future capacity to live out committed and trustworthy relationships. Fleeting relationships misuse the gift of sexual intimacy and are much more likely to be unjust, abusive, and exploitative. However, although we strongly discourage such relationships, the Church nevertheless insists every sexual relationship entails responsibility. All sexually active people have the responsibility to protect their sexual partner from both emotional and physical harm, as well as to protect themselves and their partners from sexually transmitted diseases and the possibility of an unwanted pregnancy. Now, notice what it's saying here is 1, no, and 2, be safe, and 3, work in the interest of the other, which sounds like I know you're going to do it anyway, so here's some rules. But what it's actually saying here is the reason why the church is saying don't have promiscuous relationships or casual sexual relationships is it hurts everyone. That's what the church seems to think, right? That's the case being made. Very important. And it's carried on then through adult cohabitation. Now, and basically what it says is we acknowledge that there are very rare cases or unusual cases where long-term companionship is best served through binding commitment, legal protections, and the public accountability of marriage. That some cohabitation relationships can be constructed in ways that are neither casual nor intrinsically unstable, right? That, in some past generations, betrothal was basically the same in terms of obligation as marriage today. In certain situations, covenantal or legal obligations accompany cohabitation arrangements. In these cases, such as common law marriages, these things differ markedly from transitory forms of cohabitation. But what this statement is saying is, if two people are cohabitating out of a matter of convenience only, with every expectation that one day the other could just leave, that's not safe, right? It's not helpful. It creates a dangerous situation. And the church then reaffirms, really, if two persons are living together, they should get married. Here's the problem. It keeps saying cohabitation, but it doesn't clarify that it means cohabitation with sexual intimacy, right? It's kind of implying that something else is going on here, right? Adult cohabitation is the term used. It talks about reasons, social pressures, and other factors that can delay marriage. And so it's talking about cohabitation between two people who are in some sort of romantic, committed, or sexual relationship, right? That are not married. That is what it's talking about here. It's not talking about cohabitation in general between just any group, right? It's cohabitation between two people who are a couple. Why is this important? Because this statement, in case it's not clear, is trying really hard to not focus only on issues of same-gender relationships, right? And it's actually We've basically heard most of what we're going to hear about that. What have we heard? We've heard that there's a lot of differing opinions about same-gender relationships, and we've heard that really, if you need every relationship that's romantic and of sexual nature needs to talk about monogamy, monogamous commitment, lifelong commitment, and therefore needs to work in towards marriage, right? That is a standard that's radically different from what I've encountered in our society. Have you encountered people who've done that? I mean, I know some, but it's pretty rare. What's your experience with this? Does this fit with your lived experience around how sexual relationships work? Do you think this is really kind of regressive? Are you relieved to hear your viewpoint expressed in some way? Do you have questions? Let me know. At 40 minutes, I think that's enough. Well, tomorrow, for the third and last part of this discussion, we'll look at some consequences of these statements and some wider social implications. Until then, God bless.